Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody for joining. And as people keep joining, a couple quick housekeeping rules. So we have a bunch of questions that people have submitted ahead of time for Tricia, but anything that comes up that you have a question about, feel free to just type it into the chat and I will make sure that we get them answered. Well, first off, we have a very special guest today. So I'm really excited to introduce all of you guys to Tricia Gellman. So Tricia has spent decades as a marketing leader. She was the former CMO of Drift, Checkr, and has spent almost a decade at Salesforce, and before that, Adobe, where she's been a marketing leader and built teams from scratch. She's advised and invested in numerous companies and also is truly an expert at helping companies navigate through that hyper growth phase. So welcome to our AMA today, Tricia.
Thank you for having me. It's exciting.
Well, maybe I wanted to kick it off because I think of Salesforce as being truly one of the canonical companies when it comes to excellence in go-to-market. Just feel like they have been one that people have looked at over time. And I wanted to know if there are any lessons you learned there that you've really taken with you through the rest of your career.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. One, I just want to say to people that marketing is constantly changing. And I've been really lucky that in, the past 20 plus years that I've had my career, I've really ridden those waves of marketing. And I think when I was at Salesforce, in the early days of Salesforce, Mark was amazingly smart about building a brand. And he understood the idea of really doing things to be, efficient in the spend, but also to get their name out as they were trying to disrupt, the on-prem market. And I think what I learned from that is that you can be a really small company. And if you do the right things, you can appear much larger than you are. And I think that's an important thing for all marketers to think about is how do you act and behave like the company size that you want to be versus a company size that you are. So you portray that confidence out into the market.
Any specific tactics that work well for that?
I think today, a really good content strategy today is a great way to do that. And by partnering yourself with thought leaders who, if you're a 5-person in your garage company, people are going to think, oh, well, you're not working with, who knows what big name for your vertical. But if you can really reach out to those people and try to create some level of content and engagement, I think that works really well to kind of position you to be associated with that larger thing, which therefore mentally translates to being larger. The other thing that I learned is that it makes no difference what content you create if you don't think about how you get it to market. And, one of the big things at Salesforce, I helped to build the demand gen function there. And that was really a process of connecting marketing with sales. And what I learned is a lot about what do the comp plans look like? What are the incentives for the sales team? And therefore, what are they going to do? And what's going to make a difference? If I created a lot of content, created great partnerships with some, third-party leader, and really tried to push a product that sales made no money on, or was an after sale kind of activity that they did, and I was trying to do it as new business, it just absolutely fell flat because it wasn't aligned to the overall go-to-market and the sort of operational flow of that go-to-market.
Actually, I love this topic. So how have you found best ways to build alignment between sales and marketing? Because one of the things I always bring up is the fact that the comp structure is so different. Marketing is not variable comp. Marketing salaried. Sales is variable comp, which innately creates this weird kind of misaligned incentives. So how have you been able to kind of bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to really think mentally yourself and to train your team on the fact that if your company is not making their revenue numbers, you're failing. It doesn't matter if you execute some amazing nurture program or you launch some new channel. If in the end of the day, the company is not hitting their revenue targets, no one's happy, the board's not happy, CEO's not happy. You need to really think about what is it going to take for the company to hit that number. And if you have that mentality, you're already kind of more in the mindset of a salesperson because that's how they get comped. The second thing I think is what is their incentive and how do you position to them what you're trying to do as a means to that revenue end? If you just say, well, we're going to have a great webinar and I want people to attend the webinar, so please help me do call downs to get people to this webinar, nobody's going to care. But if you can tie it to your value message and how that helps you open doors for future revenue, things like that, I think that's great. In that construct, I also think that today, ABM is a big thing. And I think, especially in today's macroeconomic times, I think a lot of people are looking at how do I do a more targeted strategy? I think the days of spray and pray are just totally done. even with the advent of AI that can like sort of help you get more broad, like I think you need to really think of like, who are you targeting and why? And when you look at that targeted list, that is a great place for sales and marketing to have conversation. Like, who are we going after? Why are we going after those people? How's it going to help us get to the revenue number? And then what are we going to do? What is sales going to do? What is marketing going to do? And how is that going to fit together to hit the goals?
That's actually a really good point, because it feels like ABM in particular, marketing can really wrap their heads around providing the right intel, messaging, and structure for sales, which sales can then take and then translate into hopefully deals.
Yeah.
How have you as a leader, I find a lot of times marketing demand gen is a little bit of an anomaly, but the rest of marketing tends to be less data driven and less really focused on measurement of the outcomes, which I think is really necessary to align yourself to revenue goals. How have you tried to shift that thinking as a leader of a marketing team?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, one thing, is especially in today's times when things are tight, like there's a lot of conversation about the revenue, the pipeline, like how are we doing? And if you focus too much on that, a lot of your marketing team sometimes feels like they're left out and they don't matter. So I think it's really important that you have a great vision for marketing, and it, spans across brand and how you look and the more like soft things, as well as revenue and pipeline and the alignment to sales and the overall goals of the company. And then I think it's really important that you break that down into like the key things that you need to do, so everyone understands what are they doing and how does that actually layer up. So maybe the creative team can't say like, oh, I did this and that brochure, or I did, whatever kind of creative thing it might be. But at the end of the day, you can talk about how like the output of creative layers up to brand, which then layers up to sort of like a broader awareness funnel, which leads down to pipeline or something like that. And I think helping everybody see that and then on a regular basis revisiting it is really important.
Yeah, that makes sense. One question I had, so I liked your framing of, how important it is to try to act and look bigger than you are. And, after Salesforce, you've been at some companies where they started off small and have gone through that hyper growth phase. What are some of the tactics you employed to do that at Checkr and Drift?
Yeah, well, actually, when I was in between Adobe and Salesforce, I actually worked at this really small startup. It was 12 people. We grew it to like 66 people. And it was basically what Wix and Squarespace are today. It was a company that was way ahead of its time trying to be that. And we had really good partnerships with some of the best photographers in the world who were building their websites on our platform. But otherwise, nobody knew of us. And so what we did is we went to the top trade shows, not like these big, broad, massive trade shows, but sort of the ones that were important to the audiences that we wanted to go to. And instead of getting 10 by 10 booths, we got like 40 by 40 booths.
Wow.
We basically said, like, who do we think is our next best competitor that we want to be known as and we want to compete against? And we try to get a booth space right next to them. And then we try to get like a 40 by 40 booth. And, just by doing that, people were like, oh, crap, like they should be like, a really substantial company if this is how big they are. Or also like buying advertising. I think, again, back to the ABM strategy, there's so many platforms today that will let you like hyper target. You could do a lot of advertising to the companies that you really want to reach through display ad. And they would think, wow, like, so-and-so company is spending so much money. They must be like a really big company to have that budget, when in fact, you're targeting like 50 companies.
That makes so much sense. It's just, presence and driving awareness, right? What people see is how they interpret you.
Exactly.
And just because other people aren't seeing that doesn't mean that the target audience isn't, perceiving you as something bigger.
Yeah, like back to the small company, it was called Livebooks. At Livebooks, the only people who were buying print ads in photo magazines were Canon and Nikon and like these huge, like, been in the market for decades and decades kind of companies. And so we started buying print ads.
That's awesome. It's funny too. I've heard a lot of companies who've had a lot of success with non-traditional channels. So dimensional mail, like sending mailers, which you don't really think of as like a digital channel at all, obviously, or print ads or things like that. And sometimes going where other people aren't, but where your audience is actually the smartest move from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think today, I mean, people like don't want spam. So you have to be somewhat relevant. And I think one of the ways to be relevant is to really understand who is your ICP, who's the buyer, who's the influencer, and like what are the channels that you can use to go to those people. And like I spoke to a really interesting, successful marketer who was targeting truck drivers. And what she did is she did like hyper research on truck drivers, because like how many of us really understand truck drivers? So she did all this hyper research and she found that they actually drive with their partners, because otherwise they would never see their partners. And so she realized that going after these women was a huge influence strategy for her to actually like make a difference in this like business to business enterprise software that she was trying to sell.
Those are my favorite stories. I think one of my all-time favorite marketing campaign stories is TurboTax, so Intuit.
Mhm.
When Farmville came out and was really big on Facebook, the TurboTax team was trying to run a big campaign right before tax season. And they realized that their target audience were middle-aged women who ran the family household. They were responsible for the taxes. And what did these people do? They played Farmville. So they had an in-game ad where you had to go and complete your tax return in TurboTax to get farm cash. And I forget how much it was.
Yeah.
It was their most successful campaign by far. And so it's just taking things that you don't think go together, but really focusing on what you said is, where does your ICP live in the digital and physical world, and make sure that that's where you are.
Yeah. And I think like today, a lot of people debate like, should we do Instagram advertising? Should we do TikTok advertising? Like all these things sound like B2C channels, but sometimes you'll find that the people who are, your top ICP personas are actually in those channels. And so there's nothing wrong with like appropriately going there. Like you clearly don't want to have the same ads in LinkedIn that you would have, the strategy in TikTok, but in the end of the day, like you could find something that becomes relevant that you're just there.
Have you seen people have success with that, where B2B companies are going on some of the more consumer channels?
This truck driver company that I was talking to. Yeah, because they met these people like on the road. And so they were like, there were some influencers that were in this sort of truck driver persona that were out there, and they were sort of like telling people like the best places to go, the best places to stop, like different things that they were doing along the road. And they started to, sponsor those channels and reach out to those influencers.
That's so cool. I mean, the reality is the vast majority of people are on these social media channels. And I think you brought up a really good point of the messaging has to be appropriate, and the type of content you create has to be, native.
Yeah.
And that actually feels like something where AI is actually really well positioned to help, meaning understanding right now what is popular and resonating on these different channels, and how do we translate that into our content.
Yeah. I mean, I even think like at Drift, one of the co-founders had, children who were of the age that they were trying to do TikTok all the time. And so he was on TikTok, and he was always doing like the, how can you do the dance and this and that kind of videos with his children as a way to kind of fit in his family. And I think you could just do that and like make sure that the people who you think are your audience would see it.
Yeah. The other kind of adage that I've heard before, and I'm not sure how well this would apply to like a TikTok or Instagram, is that any new channel is unsaturated at the beginning, especially when they launch a new ad platform. And it feels like a good opportunity for people to take advantage of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's not new, but I would say one of the things that we found, and I found in almost every company I've been in to be successful, is Bing advertising.
Really?
Yes. Like you don't think of it because you think like, who in the world is doing search in Bing? But I mean, companies that have standardized on the Microsoft platform, in a lot of cases, they have default browsers set to Bing because that's how, out of the box things function. And so there are audiences of enterprise B2B sort of companies that are out there in Bing, and it's ridiculously less in cost. And yet you can sometimes reach like a really great audience. So I always encourage companies to try the campaigns that are working for them in Google and Bing.
And these are search ads?
Yeah.
Wow. Any other channels like that you found that actually perform well?
I think that's the biggest sort of sleeper one that I found.
I've actually never tested that, so I love that. That's great. I'm going to take a note of that one.
Yeah.
Question for you on Drift in particular. So Drift, I think of also as this really interesting success story where when Drift was kind of coming up, and again, this is my perception, Intercom was the big fish, and it felt like they were dominant in the space, and Drift was kind of like trying to nip at their heels. And then I felt like all of a sudden it did a reverse where Drift was everywhere and Intercom started losing market share. How did you guys do that? What were the tactics, or what were the things that actually got you guys to be essentially overtaking them, or at least at par?
Yeah, I think a lot of that happened before I was the CMO at Drift, but obviously we continued it. I think the biggest strategy was the sort of content and how can we be everywhere strategy. I mean, this is something that David Cancel then taught, David Gerhardt, and they literally just did like an all-out war on building the brand. And I think building the brand relevant to marketers, they said, we know that we're going after marketers. We want to help marketers find a new channel to sort of, drive toward their goals. And they just like went out and said, we're going to help marketers learn how to do marketing. And I think this is a really big content strategy around building a category. How do you not just talk about what you do, but how do you know the persona and talk about what helps them, so that independent of them, like understanding chat and everything else, they're actually coming to you. So talking about marketing as a whole, the changes in marketing. When I was there, what we needed to do was actually pivot, not just from sort of like, hey, we're this brand that's going to sort of take down Intercom, but we're going to be even bigger than that, which is like to tie to something that the CMO cared about versus the individual marketer. And so we pivoted the brand and started talking about revenue. And, that was relevant to the CRO and the CMO, which in this sort of chat and conversational marketing strategy is what you want to do, is bring sales and marketing together. And so we started talking about revenue sources and like what makes revenue. How do we educate marketers on compensation and incentives for sales and sort of help them to bridge that gap? And that was really successful. And I think where Intercom was mostly focused on SMB and on sort of the starting from service, Drift started being known as like the brand for marketers.
At the beginning, when you're either trying to create that category or really kind of figure out what your ICP cares about and align with that, do you find that it's more important to start with a small number of people where you're getting really passionate people and really deeply understanding them, or are you going more for math at the beginning?
I think in the beginning, you want to try and go like, you want to have high cadence of like things in the market. So like lots of blog posts that you promote, or like writing lots of blog posts, or putting lots of LinkedIn posts up, etc. It also gives you the opportunity to see like what's working, what's sticking, and what's not. I think like Google and the ad platforms are great for that, because you can also like do like different ads that you can test different words and see like where are those things resonating. But then, I mean, it's all tied to like building that awareness funnel and broadening it as much as you can, so that you really like get your brand out there. And then you have the opportunity to kind of like double down and try and pull people through.
Makes sense. Do you view on the ad platforms and things like that, do you view it as more awareness and brand campaigns, or do you use that as also more mid-funnel or try to get conversion when you're in a B2B company?
I think both. Yeah. I think you want to do like awareness and you want to do mid-funnel. I think it's really important to think through, like even in the early days, like what are you talking about and how does it actually like lead to the bottom of the funnel? You don't have to talk about the bottom of the funnel stuff, but like we're not going to go out and do things for service and success people when what we're trying to do is help people understand revenue about like the top of the funnel and how they connect to sales. So, you got to make sure that these are the things that like, oh, then what Drift does is Drift helps to connect sales and marketing to actually identify revenue and close deals. And so you want to make sure that you've thought through like, what is this funnel that you're trying to build? What are the topics that are related to it? And how do you actually talk through those? And I would say that some people like mentally are already in the market and understand the concepts. So you want to hit them with the mid funnel stuff. Other people like don't really even understand the concepts. They're kind of like later into the market. And so that's where you like the awareness is much more important.
Got it. Makes sense. It's thinking the whole funnel and who's appropriate for which step.
Yeah. I think the other thing is like when Drift started doing this stuff, they were talking about like, how can you be a marketer? And then they were talking specifically about their solution. And I think when you get later in sort of like the size of your company, you can talk more just toward the top of the funnel because people already have a sense of what you do. But in the early days, you have to like reinforce what you do.
Yep. Makes sense. And probably as you change messaging too, it's even more important to really hit home, like this is what we do now.
Yeah.
You've been kind of at the forefront of more tech for decades at this point. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've seen the technology evolve and how that's really helping enable the marketing team to either, essentially scale what they're doing, do more with less, align better with sales. What have you kind of seen over the last, 20 years?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is like when I never meant to be a marketer. So when I grew up and I went to school to be a graphic designer, and I really loved problem solving. And I saw graphic design and creativity as a way to solve those problems. And at the same time, like this sounds stupid, but the computer came out and helped designers actually transform how they were doing their creative skill. And so that's how I ended up at Apple and then at Adobe. And when I was at Apple, I went to join the Guy Kawasaki team of evangelists, but the company was reorging every 3 months. And so like 8 weeks into my job on the evangelism team, they reorged and they told me that I was now in marketing. And I went home and I cried because marketing I thought was useless. All I thought it was like billboards and like TV advertising, kind of like, what's that TV show?
Mad Men.
Mad Men. Yeah, thanks. And so I thought I was just going to be one of these women in the corner and like there was no place for me. And then I quickly realized the impact that the brand and marketing and sort of different tactics that you could do could have on the business and helping to drive revenue. So luckily I stayed in marketing. But, back then when I first started, literally there were no tools to measure. It was very hard to measure what the impact of marketing was. And so I think that's one of the biggest things is sort of like through the development of like digital tech and the sort of direct response, we've been able to measure a lot more. And that's what I saw at Salesforce is I was able to, build those funnels and work with operations to like measure down to the specific ad that we were running in Facebook, not Facebook as a channel, but the ad and how is that really converting to our goals and to be able to talk to sales about that so that they can understand like, why does this matter versus that matter? I think that's what is exciting about marketing and why I've continued to like really like it is that it's always changing. The reason that like now that I'm not a full-time CMO, I'm like still doing advising and board work is that I'm so passionate about marketers and their ability to help drive go-to-market that like I don't want to be out of the conversation. And now with AI, it's like even more exciting because every team I think back to has struggled to find the resources to execute great campaigns. And
Yes.
you're always wondering, like, I always tried to build like a really good funnel of interns, no matter what company I was at, because there's so much busy work, just like creating the campaigns in Salesforce so you can tag things the right way, doing the tagging, getting things attached, like even just building out, like you have an ad, but you need it to be in like 24 formats. And you're like looking at this folder on your drive, wondering like, did I build all the right sizes and shapes and for this platform and that platform? And like, I think that's where like AI is super exciting because you don't have to fret about that. And you don't have as like the marketing leader, hopefully like AI can help us so that more of that stuff is done through AI and your team is not complaining to you about how they're as overworked and like annoyed with the minutia of this kind of marketing execution. And people can focus more toward the strategy.
I think you bring up so many good points there. The first one that I really want to touch on is I love this concept of marketing getting more data driven. And what I've kind of seen over time is as marketers get more tooling and get more data driven, it also corresponds with increasing budget because they're seen no longer as a cost center, but now a revenue driving center.
Yeah.
And marketing today has one of the largest budgets, if not the largest budget among the team. So it's been interesting to watch that evolution. And then I think the second point you bring up is just so spot on right now, which is every single team in the current market economy has had to figure out how to do more with less. It's less people, less budget, less tools. And that, means everyone is strapped. They're doing a ton of busy work. And that's really where some of these new AI tools can step in and really help their team do a lot more with less while still maintaining that same level of rigor and measurement and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen some tools where even the AI-ness of the tool isn't so much necessarily like you don't have to use it to like create every single implementation of what you're doing, but by having it involved in your process, like you get amazing insight and back to the data, right? Which like people maybe weren't seeing before. And then back to your question about like, how do you drive your team and have them feel connected? If you have a creative team that maybe like doesn't want to do that minutia, they want to be more in sort of like creative strategy and like, what are we doing? now they can see like which of the ads and which of the creative executions are actually working or not working, which like helps the creative team be more data driven, which was sort of out of, their realm in some cases before. So I think that that's really cool. And I just want to revisit back to your point about the budget. I'm really passionate about marketers wanting and trying to attach themselves to revenue, because if you look at the conversations that happen in the boardroom and for the CEO and what they care about, it's revenue. It's not leads. I mean, then maybe you have some, CEOs who really care about like, what does my company look like and the brand? So that's good if you find one of those CEOs, but a lot of them are sort of like product and eng driven. And so they don't really get that. And the conversation they have is really like, oh, where are people seeing us? How are we contributing to revenue, et cetera? And so if I think that the marketing leadership role is one of the most strategic roles in a company, because you touch everything. And revenue today, like everyone as a marketer needs to understand, revenue today is not just about new business. It's not just about building your brand and awareness. It's about wowing your customers when they come on board. It's about helping them be successful with adoption, especially as we move into consumption-based pricing. Like you don't have any consumption-based pricing if you don't adopt a product, and then doing expansion. And I see that as like a complete flywheel, right? Like you bring people in, you make them successful, you make more revenue from that, they become huge advocates, they talk about them in the market, you get more word of mouth, it just becomes this whole cycle. And so those are important things, which if you can show it, get you more budget as well.
And to your point, marketing is pretty much the only connective tissue between every single one of those pieces, if you think about it.
And product. So marketing is involved and can be involved in aligning sales, customer success, product, and everyone around the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you thinking that team construction might actually shift now that we do have a lot more of these AI co-pilot tools?
I mean, I think one of the things that's happened as like tech and the MarTech stack has grown is that the team really had to change. And that was something like I learned through trial and error. Like I tried to launch tools when I was at Salesforce and realized, holy cow, I have no one to do project management across the implementation of this tool. I have no one who can like sit side by side with IT to help make sure that this is like working with the rest of the IT infrastructure. And at Salesforce, there were like a lot of IT gates. And so I think like having program management and marketing program management is really important for, marketing leaders today. And then also really thinking about like, how do these things all fit together and work together, which I think in the past, like marketers have been pretty happy to just like have siloed teams, but you really have to, do that connective thread across everybody that you maybe didn't have to do as much before.
Have you seen what I observed over the last decade is that marketing was one of the worst offenders when it came to this proliferation of SaaS, where they started adopting 15 different tools. And to your point of having siloed teams, you have an email marketer that sits in one tool and a paid digital person sitting in a different tool and a social person in another tool. Are you seeing that start to shift? And I guess among the companies you're talking to or advising now, how are people thinking about that new stack going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think in COVID, people were forced to look at like their stack because CFOs basically came through and said, like, you have 15 tools, you're one marketing team, like this makes no sense. You're also the only team that has this many tools, like it makes no sense. And so, people were forced into some levels of consolidation. I think the market itself has also had some levels of consolidation since 2020 with like one group buying another group, et cetera. And I think like marketers really need to identify like what are the critical tools, but with the proliferation of ABM, you see a lot of questioning about marketing automation. Like, does that make sense? Why do you need it? I think like there's still a lot of value in building nurture, but like when I was at Salesforce, we got rid of nurture and we started using the marketing cloud tool, which is more of like a non sort of nurture product and more like a email sending product. But it was so smart that what we were able to do was instead of building nurtures, we built smart email sends that went into like a cadence. So if you actually downloaded X type of tool that had like been built for X persona in Y part of the funnel, then we followed up with the email that had like the next things in it. And so it was built as triggers, but it wasn't marketing automation. It was triggers with dynamic content boxes.
Got it. Based off of how the user behavior.
user behavior and what we had identified for like persona and topics. So like if the topic was around sales and you were a sales person, then you would go into like this flow of like 5 to 6 emails that related to the sales topics and also brought you down the funnel. If you were a marketer and you were in the sales topic, then we would actually serve you another sales topic, but a marketing topic to see if you would actually like move yourself into what we had built as a marketing triggers. And so everything was a dynamic object and it would like move people along. So I think like you need to think about what tools do you have for what purpose. And like, if you have a really big base of people coming in, maybe that's something that you need to continue to have. If you have more of like a very specific, like narrow market, maybe like your ABM platform and other things is sort of more specific to what you need.
That makes a lot of sense. Probably focus on who your audience is and what they need, essentially.
Yeah, and what's your go-to-market? Like, is your go-to-market require that you're like super big and broad, or is it really about going to like a few and going deep?
Yeah, that tool sounds pretty great. I'm surprised more people don't adopt that.
I think people are afraid to do dynamic email because you can't measure it in the same way.
So you can't review it either.
Yeah, you can't view it like, in the same way. You can't build it out in the same sort of like static way. But I mean, we saw like our email go from like nothing to like 75 million in pipeline.
Wow. That's amazing.
It was crazy.
Wow. That's great. Well, you should write a post on that as a case study at some point of like best practices and doing that. That seems like something that would be valuable.
Mm-hmm.
A question for you, as it relates to kind of some of the AI adoption in ABM, I'd love to hear your thoughts on best practices around ABM. And I guess how you think some of the, some of the AI products can actually now enable a lot more people to adopt ABM and to really focus on personalization by the persona, by the account. Have you seen anybody doing anything really well?
I mean, actually right now, like I still see people testing in AI, outside of like your general like blog post content development. Like I think a lot of people are still in testing mode and they haven't done like huge amounts of execution where they're actually like pairing products together. I would say like the only place I've seen that is in sequence creation. So there's
SDRs.
like, what's that?
For SDRs.
Yeah, for SDRs. So like, how can you actually like build smarter, more personalized sequences, that you would push out into like SalesLoft or Outreach or something like that. And I think that that's great because honestly, as a marketer, I always struggled with sales writing their like sequences themselves and like looking at what was in there and or like salespeople actually like writing sequences themselves. So I think that that's been, really helpful. And it kind of goes toward what you're saying around ABM, which is like they're going after specific accounts. But I haven't seen a lot of people yet like doing like advertising and ad creation that way. But I think that's where there's like tons of opportunity, I think.
Agreed. It definitely feels extremely early. It seems like when I talk to a lot of CMOs around their ABM program, it's really interesting because when I think ABM in my head, I think one company, one person, and then specific messaging, specific ads, specific marketing materials. But in reality, it's one to many. It's essentially, we're going to take an entire swath of people that fit a broad description, like, oh, they're at a healthcare company, and we're going to call that ABM. And so it feels like there's a really good opportunity to essentially do what ABM is supposed to be and be much more specific and personalized and unique.
Yeah. Actually, I think like earlier, I think what's interesting about AI, and like, I don't know if we're going to get into AI more, but people, I think that think like AI is new.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, when I was at Salesforce and we were doing, like I was talking about like the dynamic email, we were talking about AI and the ability for it to like understand like when's the best time to send an email on what platform to whom, et cetera. I mean, and this was a long time ago. And I think like one of the companies that, really was using AI already and is in like a category of using AI, now I'm forgetting all of their competitors, is Uberflip. And like Uberflip was and is doing this sort of like one-to-one company and like building dynamic websites. So it's like, if you're targeting Coca-Cola, when they come to your website, it's gonna be like, oh, well, welcome Coca-Cola. And like, we've created this content flow for you. And so like people have been doing that and seeing good returns. I think people are still leery, even though like we live in this AI world. When you go somewhere and you see like your company name in an ad, like I think people still get creeped out a little bit.
I think so. I think that's going to change so quickly because, to your point, AI has been around for decades at this point.
Mhm.
And I think the last big wave of AI was automation. It was the whole RPA and like truly automating flow. But the thing that feels different now, and if we use the Uberflip example, which is a perfect one, is this concept of generative AI. And so with Uberflip, it's awesome because you're, doing reverse IP lookup, or you're figuring out who we think this person is, what account, and we're going to show them something you pre-configured for them. But this new wave of generative AI can actually go and write all that content. They can actually create it. And that's something that unlocks, think of how much time that saves from your team, the manual work of going and configuring that.
Yeah. And like we were using AI at Drift, and we had like our own AI, our own engine. And so we were using like the knowledge that was coming through like Google's chat to sort of be like a foundational backbone. But then we had like our own AI, and we had our own teams that were training that AI in conversation for the customer. And we would be able to help people have full on conversational threads that were AI specifically generated.
Nice. And I'm sure that definitely helped with the product a lot in terms of. I'm gonna mute this person. Sorry about that. But I would imagine that definitely helped significantly in terms of product adoption and usage.
Yeah, it was great. I think honestly, that was at this point like 5 or 6 years ago. And I think a lot of people were still confused about like how it was working and what was doing. And back to that idea of sort of like the dynamic email versus like your programmed marketing automation. I think people still like, they have a hard time understanding like what's working, what's not, and like how do they talk about it. So maybe that's something over time as marketers we need to figure out, and something that Tofu needs to think about is like, how are you selling the value of what you're doing when it is generated, like not pre-programmed, but like on the fly.
I think that's a great point. And also it kind of comes back to some of your points before, is it all has to be tied to revenue. At the end of the day, how do you tie it to the things that the CEO, the board, and the executive team care about? And I think if you can't do that, it's a harder sell, especially in this economic time.
Yeah.
Question. So you were mentioning it's super early when it comes to AI, and I could not agree more. It's really funny when I talk to a lot of CMOs and CROs, everyone's excited about it. And it feels like there's an equal amount of excitement and kind of trepidation of not exactly knowing what to do. But everyone's in the experimental phase. What are you most excited about? Where do you think this has the most power to actually change the marketing function?
I think it's back to that sort of like entry level marketer. Like I think, people who are passionate about marketing, they get involved in marketing, not because they want to sit there, like, programming like the words and what campaigns were going on in a Salesforce campaign code and things like that. Like they get excited about marketing because they want to see like a great social campaign or billboards or whatever it might be. And I think for the early marketer, like having AI gives them the opportunity to become strategic sooner than like previously people entering in, like they probably were all excited and then they got going in their job and they're like, oh my God, this is boring, but I have to put in my time.
Yeah. Are you of the mindset that marketing leaders should, from a top-down perspective, kind of do the evaluation and then roll out tools to their team? Or some people are of the mind of like, right now, let our people play, like let them go and adopt things and test things and see what's actually working for them, their workflows, and then we'll figure out what to bring in. Which approach do you like better?
I would go for the bottoms up approach for sure. I always in like tool evaluation, I have identified like these are places where I think that we should look at tools for the X reason. Like I think you need to look at what is the problem you're trying to solve. I think a lot of people don't look at the problem. They just say like, oh, I heard about this tool, so I'm going to go test it. I'm going to hear about this tool. In the end of the day, if you do that in a bottoms up way and everyone's just like, I use this tool and I like it, like it's useless. So if you do the bottoms up, you need people to think about the problem they're solving and be able to articulate whether it's working to solve the problem versus just being like, I like it. And now like, let's have way more tools in the stack. But I always had the approach of like, okay, we need to do ABM. Like who's going to own this? Who's going to use it? How is it going to impact them? And like, how do we get that team to go out and do the evaluation and come back to me and pitch me on like which solution we should go after?
Yeah.
And I think it's much more successful that way. I haven't been that successful in like identifying tools myself and pushing them down into the team.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's been interesting to your point on ABM. I've seen all of a sudden there's been an explosion over the last few years of people with ABM in their title. So to your point of assigning a human, like an actual person, where that is your responsibility, I'm now seeing that as a kind of very common persona among the marketing team, which is cool. I mean, it makes sense.
Well, I think that like that's something that's interesting to think about. And I think like back to how teams have changed is like marketing operations didn't really exist like, 15 years ago. And then I think as we've been able to measure more, you have the marketing operations team. And that's kind of like this like catch-all for your analysts who are helping you understand what's going on, the people who are executing the different tools, and the people who are kind of like building out dashboards and like just generally building out the reporting versus like analyzing the reporting. And some tools really require like a fractional person or sometimes even a full-time person to run them. And some tools, you can kind of like put in place and then they like act as sort of like foundational in the background. But I think it's a misnomer for people that they're going to adopt like something and they're not going to need at least a fraction of a person to help like build it and execute it. And so I think that's like a question for AI today is as you like layer in new tools, do you need people who are like constantly being evolved? Like I would believe that every AI solution today needs somebody at least 25% that's like monitoring, managing, and helping like the team adopt the solution because you need to see what works. You need to see if it like continues to work. Does the AI kind of like go off the rails? Like where are things like working and going to continue to work? And so that's something for people to consider as well.
I think you're exactly right. It's interesting because until we started adopting 15 tools, you didn't need MOPS or RevOps or anything like that. And now you needed a human to go and manage and string them together and get data out of each and, merge it and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that that's not going to go away with AI tools. You're still.
I mean, that was one of the biggest things that we saw at Drift is that like people thought, oh, we can set up conversational marketing. We're going to identify our offers. We're going to identify the conversations. We're going to identify like what the outpoints should be. And then we just like set it and forget it because it just like lives there. And the people who did that, almost always after like a year of having the solution, they're like coming back questioning like, oh, what's the value of this solution? Whereas the people who actually had people involved in using it and thinking about it as like, what is my website conversion strategy? And like, how am I using this to increase conversion off of everything I do in marketing? Like those are the people who were successful because they actually paid attention to it and they were like continually optimizing, expanding, and continuing to like make it valuable.
And treating it as a true channel, right? Not just a tool.
Yeah.
It's also funny, I found, and I'm guilty of this, where I love tools and I was an engineer, so I love like actually doing the configuration and the A/B testing and the optimization. When I leave, nobody else has that knowledge or insight. And so I'm also finding that this becomes a huge problem when you have multiple tools is there's institutional knowledge of exactly how something was set up, how it works, how to configure it that immediately disappears when that person leaves. So
that's a really good point. So I think that goes back as well to like really documenting your goals. Like, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? And then if you can, documenting like, what are you doing? So that you can attach sort of the goals and the why to like the outcomes. And then like, hopefully you have people stay on your team, but if you have that transition, I mean, you also like have the people who are like acing that like decide, oh, like I've done this and now I want to do something else. So like, you have to continue to like not pigeonhole them into like, oh, you're sitting over here, like managing this solution and you can't do anything else.
Totally. I feel the same way. It's like, once I figured out something that was working, I got bored and then I wanted to go do something different.
Yeah.
So totally. I think we have time for one last question. If anybody from the audience wants to type anything into the chat, if not, I have a few others that I'm curious about. Well, I'll do one. And if somebody has one, I'll ask that too. So one of my favorite questions is, look, like you've been at a bunch of companies, led a bunch of teams. I'm sure you've had repeat pain points over and over again that you're like, if I had a magic wand and could just like wave my magic wand, here's the solution I want to fix this thing. Like, what would that be?
Wow. I think it's like, so I think even though a lot of the tools we're talking about have been in the market forever, for some reason, like you always wake up and one day things are broken.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, okay, our pipeline went down and we have like 25% less leads. And oh my God, what happened? Like these keywords aren't important anymore, et cetera. And then all of a sudden you dig in and it's like, oh, somebody changed an API and we didn't realize it. And like, that whole channel stopped contributing for like the last week. And so like, that would be my magic wand. It's like, how do you just keep things working that you've already proven are working and set up in the tooling, so that like, you're not having to assign a fractional person to just like watch the numbers every single month.
The joke is though, there's so many parallels to what you said for the engineering team, and they do literally have a person where that is their responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, the best marketing analysts are the people who understand like where are the numbers coming from and why, and then they can like identify the anomalies and also watch for those like blips so that you continue to perform.
Yes. And I think, again, like there's a bunch of these tools that are anomaly detection or trying to do explainability about like why data is definitely more on the consumer side, but I don't think any of them work well enough, nor they still require humans to go and like figure out what's going on and things like that. So I agree. That would be a beautiful solution if one were to exist. I would like that as well. Awesome. Well, Tricia, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Got a wealth of knowledge and looking forward to hearing from you again very soon. And I still think you should go and write that blog post.
I have to like go back and partner with my email leader, and maybe we can write like a great article in LinkedIn or something.
Honestly, I think people would really like that. I mean, I personally would definitely read that. So Let me know if it happens.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.